The letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, thin and ordinary, tucked between electricity bills and supermarket flyers. Yet something about the way my sister's handwriting leaned unevenly across the envelope made the air feel heavier before I even opened it. Daniel had just returned from a 12-hour shift at the factory overseas, his boots still dusted with metal filings, his shoulders carrying years of sacrifice no one back home had ever truly seen. For nearly 9 years, he had lived in a country that never felt like home, sending nearly everything he earned back to the village he still called his own. Every month, without fail, money left his account and traveled across oceans toward the family house his late father had built brick by brick. He imagined his mother resting easier, his younger siblings finishing school, the roof repaired, the garden flourishing again. That belief had sustained him through loneliness, cheap rented rooms, and holidays spent staring at phone screens instead of sharing meals. He opened the letter slowly, expecting news about repairs or perhaps another request for help. But the words inside fractured something deeper. His sister wrote carefully, almost apologetically, explaining that their older brother, Victor, had finalized the land transfer weeks ago. The house, the farmland, everything now legally belonged to Victor alone. Daniel's name, once listed beside theirs, had been removed from the proper documents. At first, the words refused to make sense. Removed? There had to be a mistake. Daniel had paid for the renovations, the medical bills when their mother fell ill, the school fees, even Victor's failed business debts. He had never asked for ownership. He only believed it was understood that the home remained shared, a symbol of family continuity. He reread the letter again and again, searching for clarification that never appeared. His hands trembled, not from anger yet, but from disbelief, the slow dawning realization that something irreversible had happened while he was away working for people who barely knew his name. That evening he called home, expecting explanations, apologies, anything that might restore balance. The call rang longer than usual before Victor answered. His voice sounded distant, formal, stripped of brotherly warmth. Victor explained calmly that since Daniel had been absent for years, managing the property had become complicated. Legal adjustments were necessary, he said. Practical decisions for stability. He spoke of paperwork, responsibilities, taxes, excuses wrapped in polite language that avoided the truth. Daniel felt pressing against his chest. When Daniel asked why no one had consulted him, Victor paused, then replied that decisions had to be made by those physically present. The sentence landed like a verdict. Daniel's absence, the very sacrifice meant to support them, had been turned into justification for exclusion. Their mother briefly came onto the phone, her voice fragile and hesitant. She said she trusted Victor to handle matters. She reminded Daniel he was doing well abroad and didn't need land anymore. Her words were not cruel, yet they carried an unfamiliar distance, as though gratitude had slowly faded into expectation and expectation into entitlement. After the call ended, Daniel sat in silence while memories rose uninvited. Carrying bricks beside his father as a teenager, promising to protect the family after the funeral, sending his first paycheck home with pride that nearly made him cry. He realized he could recall every transfer amount without checking records because each payment represented a missed opportunity, a postponed dream, a life placed on hold. That night, he barely slept. Questions looped endlessly. Had this been planned for years? Had every thank you message concealed a different intention? The next morning, he requested leave from work, something he had never done except for emergencies. His supervisor noticed the change in his usually steady demeanor and approved the trip without hesitation. Daniel packed lightly, unsure whether he was returning home or confronting strangers wearing familiar faces. During the long flight, he stared out the window as clouds passed beneath him, remembering how often he had imagined this journey filled with joy, reunions, laughter. Instead, a quiet dread, followed him across continents. He rehearsed conversations in his mind, searching for words strong enough to express betrayal, yet gentle enough to preserve family bonds. By the time the plane landed, exhaustion had replaced anger, leaving only a heavy determination. The village looked smaller than he remembered. Roads felt narrower, houses older, as though time had moved differently here. Children he once knew now walked past him without recognition. When he reached the family home, he stopped at the gate, noticing subtle changes. The fence had been repainted, the garden redesigned. Even the front door color was different. None of these updates had ever been mentioned. Victor emerged from the house with a cautious smile, greeting him with a brief embrace that ended too quickly. Inside, Daniel saw new furniture, expensive appliances, signs of comfort funded by years of remittances. Yet something was missing. His father's old chair had disappeared. The photographs once lining the hallway were rearranged, many featuring Victor prominently, while Daniel appeared only in older frames, frozen in time before his departure. The atmosphere felt curated, as though history itself had been rewritten. Over dinner, conversations remained shallow. Victor spoke about local business opportunities and responsibilities, emphasizing how difficult management had been without Daniel's presence. Daniel listened quietly until he finally asked to see the property documents. Silence fell. Victor's expression hardened slightly, revealing irritation beneath politeness. He explained that legal matters were already settled, and reopening them would create unnecessary conflict. Their mother avoided eye contact, focusing instead on serving food no one was eating. Daniel felt the moment shift. This was no misunderstanding. It was a decision defended by convenience and rationalization. He asked one final question, his voice calm but heavy. When had they decided it no longer belonged to the home he had supported? Victor responded with a shrug that carried years of resentment. He said Daniel had chosen another life abroad. The house needed an owner who lived there. The words exposed a deeper truth. Sacrifice had been interpreted as abandonment. Generosity had been mistaken for distance. That night, Daniel lay awake in his childhood room, now used as storage, realizing the betrayal was not sudden but gradual, built through years of silence, assumptions, and shifting loyalties. Monet brought clarity sharper than anger. Daniel walked through the village greeting neighbors who welcomed him warmly, many praising his dedication to supporting the family. Several mentioned how much Victor's business had grown, thanks to Daniel's investments. Hearing strangers acknowledge what his own family minimized awakened something resolute inside him. He visited the local municipal office, requesting copies of property records. The clerk recognized his name immediately, surprised to see him in person. She hesitated before explaining that the transfer had occurred under a legal declaration stating Daniel had relinquished ownership rights voluntarily. The signature attached to that declaration was not his. The realization settled slowly but unmistakably. This was not merely exclusion, it was falsification. Betrayal had crossed into deception. Daniel left the office carrying documents that felt heavier than stone, understanding that confrontation alone would not restore truth. Evidence would. That evening he returned home, watching Victor laugh comfortably on the porch, unaware that the narrative carefully constructed over years was beginning to unravel. Daniel did not argue. He simply placed the copied documents on the table and asked Victor to explain the forged signature. The confidence drained from Victor's face, replaced by defensive anger. He insisted it was a misunderstanding handled by a lawyer. Paperwork completed quickly to avoid delays. The mother began to cry, pleading for peace rather than truth. Daniel understood then how families sometimes choose comfort over fairness, silence over accountability. But something inside him had changed during the journey home. He was no longer the naive younger brother grateful for acceptance. He was a man who had earned every sacrifice through years of labor, loneliness, and unwavering loyalty. He told Victor calmly that he would pursue legal action, not out of revenge, but because integrity mattered more than appearances. The announcement shocked everyone. For the first time, Daniel saw fear replace certainty in Victor's eyes. Days passed as tension thickened within the house. Relatives visited, offering unsolicited advice, urging Daniel to forgive and avoid scandal. Many framed justice as selfishness, arguing that family unity required personal loss. Daniel listened respectfully but remained unmoved. He began meeting with a lawyer in the nearby town, presenting financial records, documenting nearly a decade of transfers that had funded property improvements and debts. Each receipt told a story no one could deny. The lawyer explained that fraud cases were complex, but strong evidence existed. Meanwhile, Victor's attitude shifted from dismissive confidence to uneasy negotiation attempts. He proposed partial compensation, suggesting Daniel accept money instead of ownership. Daniel declined. The issue was no longer material wealth, it was acknowledgement of truth. Court proceedings eventually began, drawing quiet attention throughout the village. Whispers followed Daniel wherever he walked, some supportive, others critical. During hearings, Victor claimed he believed Daniel had no intention of returning and that transferring ownership ensured stability. Under questioning, inconsistencies emerged. The forged document became central evidence. Witnesses testified about Daniel's continuous financial contributions. Even neighbors confirmed Daniel's role in sustaining the property. Sitting in the courtroom, Daniel felt unexpected sadness rather than triumph. He watched his brother struggle under scrutiny, realizing betrayal often grows from insecurity rather than pure malice. Victor had feared losing control, feared living in the shadow of a brother whose sacrifices earned admiration. Instead of gratitude, envy had quietly shaped his choices. Weeks later, the judgment arrived. The court ruled the transfer invalid, restoring Daniel's legal ownership share and recognizing the fraud committed. Victor faced penalties and mandatory restitution. The verdict did not bring celebration. Instead, it created silence heavier than any argument. Returning home afterward, Daniel noticed how differently the house felt. Victory carried loneliness. His mother approached him cautiously, tears in her eyes, apologizing for choosing peace over fairness. Danielle embraced her gently, understanding fear had guided her decisions more than cruelty. Over time, conversations resumed, though trust rebuilt slowly. Victor withdrew emotionally, ashamed yet unable to fully admit wrongdoing. Daniel chose not to humiliate him further. Instead, he proposed dividing management responsibilities transparently, establishing legal safeguards to prevent future manipulation. Months passed, and Daniel remained longer than planned, rediscovering parts of himself forgotten abroad. He repaired his father's old chair, rehung family photographs, including newer ones that acknowledged everyone's role honestly. The house transformed again, this time through reconciliation rather than control. One evening, Danielle sat outside watching the sunset wash the fields in gold, realizing the greatest loss had not been property but identity. For years, he had defined love through sacrifice alone, believing giving endlessly guaranteed belonging. Now he understood that love without boundaries invites erasure. His return had forced painful truths into the open, yet it also restored dignity. Villagers began telling the story not as scandal but as lesson. Generosity must walk beside self respect. Eventually, Daniel returned overseas briefly to conclude his work contract, but he did so differently. This time, his future included plans of coming back permanently, investing in the land with clear agreements and shared accountability. Victor slowly attempted reconciliation, offering small gestures rather than grand apologies. Healing arrived in fragments, shared meals, repaired conversations, quiet acknowledgement of past mistakes. Years later, Daniel would reflect on the moment he opened that thin envelope and realize it marked the end of one life and the beginning of another. Betrayal had forced him to confront uncomfortable realities about family, loyalty, and personal worth. He learned that absence does not erase belonging, and kindness does not require surrendering one's rights. The house remained standing, not merely as property, but as evidence that truth, though delayed, eventually finds its voice. And when Daniel finally settled back home for good, walking through the gate no longer as a visitor, but as an equal guardian of his father's legacy, he carried with him a quiet understanding. Sometimes returning home means reclaiming not just a place, but a part of yourself that once believed you deserved nothing in return. The days following the court ruling unfolded with an uneasy stillness, the kind that settles over a place after a storm has passed, but before anyone dares to assess the damage. Daniel remained in the house, moving carefully through familiar spaces that now carried unfamiliar tension. Every object seemed to hold memory and accusation at once. His mother spoke to him gently, almost cautiously, as though afraid any wrong word might reopen wounds that had barely begun to close. Victor avoided long conversations, leaving early each morning and returning late, his footsteps heavy with a pride struggling against humiliation. The village watched quietly. News traveled fast in small communities, and though many sympathized with Daniel, others whispered that taking one's own brother to court crossed an invisible boundary. Daniel heard the murmurs, but no longer felt compelled to defend himself. For years, he had defended everyone else. Now silence felt stronger than explanation. One afternoon, he walked through the farmland behind the house, tracing paths he had known since childhood. The soil felt dry beneath his shoes, neglected in subtle ways that revealed how business expansion had replaced care for the land itself. Victor had focused on profit, leasing sections to outsiders, while abandoning the slower traditions their father once honored. Daniel knelt and touched the earth, remembering his father's voice, explaining patience, seasons, responsibility. The realization struck him that betrayal had not only altered relationships, it had changed the spirit of the home itself. That evening, Danielle invited Victor to sit outside with him. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the yard. For several minutes, neither spoke. Finally, Danielle broke the silence, not with accusation, but with a question. When had Victor started believing he was alone? Victor's reaction was immediate irritation, followed by reluctant honesty. He confessed that managing everything while Daniel lived abroad had slowly built resentment. Villagers praised Daniel constantly, calling him generous, successful, dependable, while Victor felt reduced to caretaker rather than equal brother. Each money transfer became, in Victor's mind, a reminder that he depended on someone who was not physically present. Pride twisted gratitude into bitterness. When legal complications arose, a lawyer suggested simplifying ownership. Victor admitted he convinced himself Danielle would never return permanently, that consolidating control was practical rather than cruel. As he spoke, anger faded into exhaustion. Danielle listened carefully, recognizing the vulnerability beneath the defensiveness, yet understanding did not erase consequence. He told Victor quietly that pain explained actions but did not justify deception. Trust, once broken, demanded more than excuses. Victor nodded without meeting his eyes. In that moment, both brothers understood reconciliation would not arrive through a single conversation but through years of changed behavior. Over the following weeks, Daniel began restoring parts of the property himself. He repaired fences, cleaned storage rooms, and reopened the garden that had fallen into neglect. Neighbors occasionally stopped by, surprised to see him working with the same dedication he once showed before leaving the country. Slowly, the atmosphere around the house shifted. His mother watched from the kitchen window, relief softening her expression as familiar rhythms returned. One morning, she joined him outside carrying tea. She admitted she had feared losing both sons forever, believing confrontation would destroy the family beyond repair. Daniel reassured her that truth had saved them rather than divided them. Avoiding conflict, he explained gently, often allows injustice to grow quietly. until love itself becomes unrecognizable. His words lingered, with her long after the conversation ended. Meanwhile, Victor faced consequences beyond legal penalties. Business partners became cautious. Some villagers treated him politely but with distance, their trust shaken. For the first time, he experienced the loneliness Danielle had endured abroad, the feeling of being judged without fully understood. Instead of confronting him harshly, Daniel offered opportunities for cooperation. He invited Victor to participate in decisions openly, reviewing accounts together, and establishing transparent financial records. At first, Victor interpreted this as supervision, but gradually he realized it was an invitation to rebuild equality rather than dominance. The brothers began holding weekly meetings about the property, discussing crops, repairs, and future investments. These conversations were awkward, filled with pauses and careful wording, yet they represented progress neither had imagined possible months earlier. One evening during dinner, laughter unexpectedly returned when an old family story resurfaced. The moment felt fragile but genuine, reminding them that shared history still existed beneath layers of earth. Daniel noticed how his mother's shoulders relaxed for the first time since his arrival. Healing, he realized, rarely announces itself. It appears quietly in ordinary moments. As summer approached, Daniel received messages from his employer abroad, asking when he planned to return. The decision weighed heavily on him. For years, he had measured success by financial stability, believing distance was the price of responsibility. Now he questioned whether sacrifice without presence truly strengthened family bonds. Walking through the village market, he observed neighbors greeting one another, children running freely, elders sharing stories beneath shaded benches. Life here moved slower but felt fuller. He began imagining a future rooted not in remittances but in participation. That night, he shared his thoughts with his mother, explaining he might end his overseas work sooner than expected. Her eyes filled with cautious hope. She admitted she had missed him deeply, but never wanted to burden him with guilt. Hearing this, Daniel understood how assumptions had shaped everyone's choices. Each family member had tried to protect the others through silence, unknowingly creating distance that allowed misunderstanding to thrive. Victor overheard part of the conversation and later approached Danielle privately. With visible effort, he apologized, not defensively, not vaguely, but directly. He admitted fear had guided him more than greed. He feared being overshadowed, feared irrelevance, feared that Daniel's success abroad made him unnecessary at home. Speaking these fears aloud seemed to release something heavy from him. Daniel accepted the apology without dramatics, simply acknowledging that rebuilding trust required honesty moving forward. They shook hands, an understated gesture carrying more weight than any courtroom verdict. Days blended into routines shaped by cooperation. Together, they planned improvements to the farmland, investing in sustainable methods that honored their father's legacy. Daniel began teaching Victor financial management strategies learned abroad, while Victor shared practical knowledge about local networks and community relationships. Their strengths, once sources of rivalry, became complementary. Villagers noticed the change, conversations shifting from gossip to admiration for reconciliation. One afternoon, an elderly neighbor remarked that true strength lies not in avoiding conflict, but in surviving it without losing compassion. The words stayed with Daniel as he watched the field sway under warm wind. Yet beneath progress lingered an internal transformation still unfolding. Daniel reflected on how easily identity can be tied to usefulness. For years, he believed love depended on constant giving, fearing that stopping would make him replaceable. The betrayal forced him to confront that belief. Standing alone in the garden at dusk, he realized self-worth must exist independent of sacrifice. Generosity should flow from choice, not obligation. This realization changed how he approached relationships moving forward. He began setting boundaries gently but firmly, ensuring decisions involved open discussion rather than silent assumption. The house slowly felt like home again, not because ownership had been restored, but because dignity had returned alongside it. Late one evening, Daniel found his father's old toolbox hidden beneath stacked boxes. Inside were handwritten notes about repairs, planting schedules, and reflections about family unity. One sentence caught his attention: a home survives only when every voice is heard. Reading those words felt like receiving guidance across time. He understood that the true inheritance left by his father was not land, but responsibility to preserve fairness within the family. Holding the one notebook, Daniel felt peace settle where resentment once lived. The journey that began with betrayal was evolving into something deeper, a redefinition of belonging grounded in mutual respect rather than silent sacrifice. As autumn approached, Daniel prepared for a final return abroad to close unfinished obligations, promising this departure would not repeat the past. This time he left with agreements clearly written, communication open, and relationships rebuilt through honesty rather than assumption. Standing at the gate before leaving, he looked back at the house glowing in early morning light. Victor stood beside their mother, offering a sincere wave that carried neither guilt nor rivalry, only cautious hope. Daniel realized that returning home had not simply restored his name to a document, it had forced every member of the family to confront who they were when comfort collided with truth. And though scars remained, they no longer defined the future waiting beyond the horizon. Months passed after Daniel's departure, and the house settled into a rhythm shaped by cautious optimism. Autumn deepened into winter, and with it came the first true test of whether reconciliation could survive distance. Unlike before, Daniel did not disappear into silence once he returned overseas. Weekly video calls became routine. Financial decisions were discussed openly. Documents were shared digitally. Every choice involving the property now required mutual agreement, transforming what had once been a symbol of betrayal into a practice of accountability. At first, these meetings felt formal, almost businesslike, but gradually warmth returned. Victor began speaking less defensively, occasionally asking for Daniel's advice, rather than waiting to justify decisions afterward. The mother listened during calls, smiling quietly as conversations that once revolved around tension shifted toward planning and shared goals. Daniel noticed something unexpected happening inside himself. Working abroad no longer felt like exile. The loneliness that once defined his nights faded because he no longer carried the burden of unspoken resentment. He realized that trust, when rebuilt carefully, allows distance to exist without fear. Still, memories of betrayal lingered in subtle ways. Some evenings after exhausting shifts, Daniel found himself rechecking messages, searching for signs of secrecy that no longer existed. Healing, he discovered, was not linear. It required patience equal to the patience he once gave his sacrifices. Meanwhile, back home, Victor faced a quieter struggle. Rebuilding reputation within the village proved harder than repairing family ties. People greeted him politely, but without the easy confidence they once showed. Business negotiations required greater transparency. At first, he resented the scrutiny, but slowly he began to understand it as consequence rather than punishment. Determined to change, he started involving community members in cooperative farming initiatives, sharing profits openly, and acknowledging Daniel's financial contributions publicly. The humility surprised many who had known Victor as proud and guarded. Gradually, suspicion softened. One afternoon, he visited the municipal office himself, requesting updated records listing both brothers clearly as co-owners. Holding the corrected documents, Victor felt both relief and shame, realizing how fragile integrity becomes when pride outweighs honesty. He sent Daniel a photograph of the finalized paperwork. Daniel stared at the image for a long time before replying with a simple message: "Thank you for doing it the right way." That exchange marked a turning point neither of them needed to discuss aloud. As winter ended, Daniel began preparing to return home permanently. The decision grew slowly but decisively. Years abroad had provided stability, yet he now understood stability without belonging felt incomplete. He saved aggressively during his final months, declining overtime opportunities that once consumed his life. Instead, he spent evenings planning projects for the land, modern irrigation systems, local employment initiatives, agricultural training programs for young villagers considering migration. He envisioned transforming the property into something that benefited not only his family, but the entire community that had watched his journey unfold. The idea filled him with renewed purpose. When he finally boarded the plane home, the journey felt different from his earlier return. There was no dread, no unresolved anger waiting at the destination. Instead, anticipation replaced anxiety. He carried not just luggage but intention. Upon arrival, Victor met him at the airport alone. The reunion was quiet yet genuine. No grand speeches, only a firm embrace that lingered longer than before. On the drive back, they spoke about ordinary things: weather, crops, small village updates. Yet, beneath the simplicity rested a shared understanding that both had changed. Back at the house, Daniel noticed further transformations. His old room had been restored, not as storage but as living space prepared for his return. Photographs now reflected balanced family history, recent pictures placed beside older ones. The garden flourished again, evidence of Victor maintaining traditions Daniel had restarted months earlier. Their mother greeted him with tears that felt lighter than those shared during confrontation. For the first time in years, Daniel sensed he was arriving home rather than visiting. Spring brought energy and renewal. Together, the brothers launched the agricultural project, combining Daniel's international experience with Victor's local knowledge. They introduced crop diversification, invested in renewable water systems, and hired young workers from neighboring villages. The initiative quickly gained attention, drawing visitors curious about how two brothers, once divided by legal battle, now collaborated successfully. During community gatherings, Daniel often spoke about transparency and shared responsibility, never recounting the betrayal directly, but allowing his lessons to shape his words. Victor listened from the crowd, recognizing the speeches as acts of forgiveness more powerful than any apology. Yet growth required one final confrontation, not with each other, but with the past itself. One evening, Daniel discovered old bank statements stored in a drawer, records of every transfer he has sent home over 9 years. Seeing the numbers again stirred emotions he believed settled. He realized he had never truly mourned the years spent away from his own dreams. Sacrifice had defined him so completely that he had forgotten to ask what he personally wanted from life. That realization unsettled him. Later that night, he walked alone through the fields under moonlight, reflecting on the young man who once left home, determined to save his family at any cost. He felt compassion for that version of himself, but also sorrow. Loyalty without balance had nearly erased his individuality. Returning home had restored his rights, but reclaiming his identity required something deeper: permission to live for himself as well. The next morning, he shared his thoughts with Victor, admitting he sometimes feared becoming trapped again in endless responsibility. Victor surprised him by encouraging independence. He suggested Daniel pursue personal ambitions alongside family commitments, reminding him that partnership meant supporting each other's growth rather than relying on sacrifice. Hearing those words from the very person who once exploited his generosity felt like witnessing true change. Encouraged, Daniel began exploring interests long postponed, teaching agricultural workshops, mentoring young workers, even traveling occasionally to neighboring regions for conferences. Each new experience expanded his sense of self beyond provider or victim. Meanwhile, the mother observed both sons evolving into men capable of coexistence without competition. The house filled with conversations once absent, debates about future investments, shared laughter during meals, quiet evenings recalling their father's wisdom. One afternoon, she gathered them together and expressed gratitude not for the restored property, but for the restored relationship. She admitted her greatest fear had never been losing land, but losing her sons to resentment. Her confession revealed how deeply the conflict had affected her, reminding Danielle and Victor that betrayal rarely harms only those directly involved. As summer approached, the farm's success attracted regional recognition. Local officials visited, praising the brothers' collaboration as an example of resilience and innovation. Standing beside Victor during a small ceremony celebrating their project, Daniel felt a profound sense of closure. The same community that once whispered about legal disputes now witnessed cooperation born from accountability. Later that evening, after guests departed, the brothers sat outside watching fireflies flicker across the fields. Victor spoke quietly, admitting he sometimes wondered what would have happened if Daniel had never returned. The question lingered between them. Daniel answered honestly. The house might still stand, but family would have been lost. The statement carried neither accusation nor regret, only acknowledgement of how close they had come to permanent division. In the silence that followed, both understood that forgiveness had not erased the past. It had transformed it into foundation for something stronger. Daniel realized the journey was never solely about reclaiming his name on a document. It was about redefining what belonging meant when tested by betrayal. As night settled over the land, he felt gratitude, not for the pain endured, but for the clarity it brought. The boy who once believed love required endless sacrifice had grown into a man who understood that respect must exist alongside generosity. And as he watched the lights glow from the house behind him, he sensed that the final chapter of his story was no longer shaped by loss, but by choice. Years moved forward with a quiet steadiness that once would have seemed impossible. The house no longer carried echoes of suspicion or guarded conversations. Instead, it breathed with the rhythm of shared effort. Seasons passed like chapters turning gently rather than violently. Crops rotated successfully. The cooperative expanded, and young families returned to the village after hearing about new opportunities created on the land. Daniel often walked the fields at dawn, watching mist rise slowly from the soil, reflecting on how close everything had come to disappearing, not because of poverty or disaster, but because trust had nearly collapsed under the weight of unspoken fears. What surprised him most was how ordinary happiness felt after chaos. There were no dramatic celebrations marking healing, no single moment where everything suddenly became perfect. Healing arrived through routine. Victor knocking on his door each morning to review plans, their mother humming while preparing breakfast, neighbors stopping by without tension lingering in the air. The extraordinary became ordinary again, and in that ordinariness, Daniel found peace deeper than victory. Yet growth continued demanding honesty. One afternoon, a young worker approached Daniel privately, explaining he planned to leave the country for work abroad, just as Daniel once had. The young man spoke with excitement but also fear, asking whether leaving home meant abandoning family. The question struck Daniel deeply because it echoed his own past. He paused before answering, realizing how easily sacrifice can transform into silent expectation. Daniel told him leaving was not abandonment if communication remained alive and boundaries remained clear. Support should never erase identity, and distance should never become justification for exclusion. As he spoke, Daniel recognized he was finally able to transform his painful experience into guidance for others. Later that evening, he shared a conversation with Victor, and they discussed how migration had reshaped countless families in their community. Together, they organized workshops teaching financial literacy and legal awareness, ensuring no one else would unknowingly surrender rights through trust alone. These initiatives became one of their proudest achievements, not because they erased the past, but because they prevented its repetition. Their mother watched these developments with quiet pride. Age had slowed her steps, yet her eyes carried renewed light whenever she saw her sons working side by side. One evening, she asked them to sit with her in the courtyard As the sun set, she spoke about their father, recalling how he believed inheritance meant more than land. He used to say that property tests character more than poverty ever could. Listening to her, Daniel understood how easily love can become distorted when fear enters relationships. Their family had survived not because conflict never occurred, but because truth eventually forced growth. The conversation ended with shared laughter over childhood memories, moments untouched by rivalry or expectation. That night, Daniel walked through the house alone, touching walls that once symbolized betrayal. Now they represented resilience. He stopped in front of a framed copy of the corrected property document hanging discreetly in the hallway. Unlike before, he no longer looked at it as proof of victory. It was simply a reminder of a lesson learned. Belonging must never depend solely on sacrifice. Weeks later, Daniel received an unexpected invitation to speak at a regional conference about community development. Standing before an audience far larger than any village gathering, he recounted the importance of transparency, cooperation, and dignity within families and businesses. He avoided dramatizing his personal story, yet his words carried lived authenticity. He spoke about how generosity without boundaries invites misunderstanding and how accountability strengthens rather than weakens relationships. When applause filled the hall, Daniel felt neither pride nor discomfort, only gratitude that hardship had transformed into wisdom useful to others. Returning home after the conference, he found Victor waiting outside with news that the cooperative had achieved record success. They celebrated quietly with their mother over dinner, sharing stories late into the night. During that conversation, Victor admitted something he had never said before. He confessed that losing Daniel's trust had been the most frightening experience of his life, more painful than legal consequences or public embarrassment. He realized he had nearly destroyed the one relationship that defined his identity. Daniel listened carefully, recognizing sincerity without needing reassurance. Forgiveness had matured into mutual respect. They no longer measured each other through past mistakes, but through present actions. As years passed, new traditions replaced old wounds. Festivals were hosted on their land, drawing families together in celebration rather than gossip. Children played beneath trees their father had planted decades earlier. The house became known not for conflict, but for reconciliation, a place where disagreements were addressed openly rather than hidden. Occasionally, visitors asked Daniel whether he regretted returning to confront his family instead of walking away. He always answered the same way. Leaving might have protected his pride temporarily, but returning restored his truth. One autumn evening, long after the sun disappeared beyond the fields, Daniel sat alone at the gate, where he once stood uncertain whether he still belonged. The memory felt distant, almost unreal. He thought about the man who had opened that thin envelope years ago, overwhelmed by betrayal and confusion. That version of himself believed love required endless endurance, believed silence preserved harmony, believed gratitude guaranteed fairness. Experience had reshaped those beliefs. He now understood that love demands honesty, harmony requires courage, and fairness survives only when defended. The journey had not made him harder, it had made him clearer. Inside the house, laughter echoed as Victor and their mother prepared tea. The sound carried warmth rather than obligation. Daniel realized that forgiveness did not mean forgetting the past, but choosing not to let it define the future. He stepped inside, closing the gate gently behind him, no longer fearing exclusion because belonging now rested on mutual respect rather than assumption. Over time, Daniel began mentoring younger families, navigating financial partnerships, reminding them to combine trust with clarity. His story spread quietly, not as scandal but as lesson. People spoke about resilience, about confronting injustice without losing compassion. And though he never sought recognition, Daniel became known as someone who had transformed betrayal into foundation for community strength. One evening, years later, while sorting old papers, he found the original envelope that had started everything. The paper had yellowed with age. Holding it, he felt no anger, only reflection. That letter once symbolized loss, yet without it, he might never have returned home, never reclaimed his voice, never discovered the balance between giving and self respect. He placed the envelope back into the drawer, not hidden, not displayed, simply accepted as part of his story. Outside, the field stretched endlessly beneath a calm sky, carrying the quiet promise of continuity. Danielle stepped onto the porch and watched stars emerge one by one, understanding at last that home is not secured by names written on documents, but by relationships rebuilt through truth. And if there was one lesson his journey left behind, it was this: generosity should never require disappearance, loyalty should never demand silence, and sometimes the greatest act of love is returning, not to prove ownership, but to reclaim dignity, rebuild trust, and show that even after betrayal, a family willing to face truth together can become stronger than it ever was before.